questions from the floor? Yes, John.
Hi, John Haydock. Thanks for taking the time.
Sure, John.
You mentioned a $3.5 million cap. Based on forecast, how long would it take to tap in to exhaust that $3.5 million cap, and what sort of volume do you think that $3.5 million cap would take out of the reservoir?
Orion suggested a contract time once they get on the reservoir, I think around a year of effort, and they suggested 300,000 cubic yards was. Now they referenced HDR, who is the consultant who did this bathymetric study for us, but that was their estimate. Again, since this is a PPA process, we don't clearly define those terms. We let the proposers define them, but that was their answer.
Great. A question here from
Bob Johnson. I'm just a local property owner. How long are we buying with 300,000 cubic yards? What is the siltation rate of the reservoir?
You're going to make me dig up my memory bank. Don't hold me to this number, but I think when Gannett Fleming did some estimates several years ago, I want to think they said about 100,000 cubic yards a year. If that's true, then you can do the math from there, and it's about 3 years. I don't think it's a significantly long time. It's not a significantly large project compared to the size of the reservoir. But don't hold me to the 100,000. I'm doing this from memory. I haven't looked at that file in some time now.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Tom McIntosh. Can you or will you try and solicit more bids, or is that a closed process? Is that closed now? I mean,
the advice of our attorney is that we do owe it to a company who submitted on time and submitted a substantive proposal to evaluate it and determine if it should be under contract. We can reject all bids at any time, but that's the advice that we're following at this point in time. Now, if the proposal falls short, it could be an opportunity then to reopen it.
Another question here from
Bruce Odell. I'm a fisherman, so that's the reason I'm here principally and why I care about the reservoir. So following up a bit on that conversation, what impact, either seasonally or through that period of a total of 18 months, do you expect what the impact you'd have on the overall water quality, especially as it might affect fish, for example, spawning, and also in the longer range? You mentioned the 200 and some square miles of watershed. Mm-hmm. What steps does the authority feel it should take as an interested party in working with especially with the county, in terms of improving the water quality coming down to the major tributaries? Because as things now stand, that's not a speech, but as things now stand, there are the siltation, the water quality issues well known because in fact of development and agricultural uses. Does the authority have a position on that? Are they trying to deal with that? And then back to the question about the fish quality, if you would.
Okay. In terms of disturbing the reservoir during dredging,
yes.
We hope very, very minimal. The RFP does require grout curtains. The proposer has placed a grout curtain. If you don't, does everybody know what a grout curtain? Turbidity curtain.
They don't know.
I'm thinking the wrong dam, I'm sorry. Turbidity curtain, which goes down where they're dredging, so as the material is disturbed, it's limited within a small footprint and it can't get out in the rest of the reservoir. Long term, in terms of water quality, yes, we're very interested. Money is sometimes limited. One of the things that we did say long time ago during the water supply discussions is that we think there should at some point in time be a master plan in this community for how we're going to protect the water quality of the reservoir, and dredging should be a part of that discussion. We didn't say exactly what the answer would be. We said there should be a plan, and I think it is my hope that our water resources manager, Andrea Terry, will at some point, right now her primary project is the mitigation project for Buck Mountain Creek and Franklin Street wetland areas, which is under a deadline. But my hope is at some point in time that she will look at that project. We did a mini project, if you will, last year. I hope some of you noticed that most of the hydrilla in the reservoir is gone. We bought carp. They can't reproduce. Sterile. Thank you for the word. Sterile carp we put in the reservoir, and they did a fantastic job. The interesting thing is we monitored this year to see if any of the hydrilla came back, and it has not so far. We'll continue to monitor it. But that's something we've made a commitment to. Our board has agreed to allow us through our budget to do that, and I hope it's making a difference that some of you will appreciate.
I know all the rowers in the room, but if there are any others.
I'll also make a pitch too. I know I'm in a room with many of you who would really like to see more dredging done than the cap. I will say this: there's a lot of I'm speaking now when I'm looking at the city and the county. My charter is to provide water and sewer services to the urban area. Obviously, I have to be careful how narrowly or broadly I define that, and I have a board that I have to answer to, who helps me define how narrowly or broadly I can define that term. The city and the county, both in the urban areas, are going through a lot of, I'd say they would claim, excruciating planning right now associated with the Chesapeake Bay TMDL, which certainly is going to put an onus on developers to do more for erosion and sediment control in the future. And most of you would probably say that's a good thing. It's also going to require some retrofits if it goes through, meaning some existing developed sites are going to have to retrofit to put in stormwater measures. And what the city and the county are wrestling with right now is who pays for all that? Does the public have to pay for that? So when we're talking about let's do more dredging of the reservoir, I think they're kind of concerned right now that their plate's very full. But if at some point in time a consortium, Ravenna can play a role in it, city, county, I'm going to even suggest UVA, be willing to put some money into it. Maybe we can get more dredging done than what's in our budget right now.
Looking at, around a year or so for the project, as I understand it, what, if any, restrictions of usage will be imposed on this part of the reservoir during that time? Simply put, will we all be able to kayak and fish and canoe and do all of the things that we normally do, or will that be completely shut down during that process?
I'm going to say at this location here, the answer is 99% yes, you will be able to. I don't want to say 100% at this point. We are not far enough in the conceptual phase to know all the details of what our contractor is going to expect, but if our contractor does what they've said at this point, which is they're going to dredge the upper 3 segments of the reservoir, and they're going to use panorama pay dirt as the site for handling the material, and they're going to use the UVA rowing site. All this is assuming they get these permissions to use for their launch. If those contracts all get inked as they are suggesting they would like to see, I see no reason why they should be down here. The only reason that might change is if a deal falls through and they have to go get another property owner and they get somebody down on this end of the reservoir. It's the only way I can see that happening.
Great, thank you.
There was a question here.
Yes, thank you. Could you?
That's Tom Jones.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, we've got a lot of Toms in the room tonight.
Live in the Earlysville Coastal Service area, and the sections that are identified on the RFP and were responded to, sections 1, 2, and 3 are upstream. How and why and by whom were those picked? How did you pick those sections of the reservoir?
HDR suggested that those were the most economical, and it's because sand has a higher value on the marketplace. And that was what our board, in conjunction with the county and city, thought would be a place to get the best bang for the amount of dollars that they were willing to put into it. Also, one of the things that could be attractive with this option, there's been some conversation in public meetings before here about this idea of having a forebay area where you can try to remove sediment before it gets into the reservoir. neat idea, out of the box, visionary. The problem is that you'd have to really get all of the sediment out of the reservoir before it gets into the reservoir. You'd have to build something with a surface area comparable to the reservoir upstream of it, so it makes it impractical. But the idea is sand, predominantly sand, settled in that upper area. If that area is cleaned out, it provides the place for sand to fall out again. If it fell out once before, it's probably going to fall out there again because it's just physics. And if that happens, and that keeps the sand from migrating further downstream and settling in deeper portions of the reservoir, at least as quickly. And of course, it depends on how often you come back, because if it fills up in 3 to 5 years, then you're back where you are today.
Other questions? Yeah, we have one here.
In terms of launching and then the takeout area, is the launch a daily operation, or is the launch beginning of event and after the end of the event, and the actual dredge stays up in the area that they're clearing out?
Based on what I understand other dredgers have done, my guess is that the dredge stays in the reservoir overnight. Now, whether they, one thing they may do if they start, depends on what time of year they may start. If we're in winter months and there's, especially like January's here, can be very, very cold. There's a chance of ice forming on the reservoir. They probably pull the dredge out during that period. So there may be more than one launch and more than one capture, but it won't be like they're pulling it in and out every day.
Question over here? Yeah.
Kevin Sauer. So if you, I'm sure you thought of this, but from a standpoint of marketable material, and your RFP was fairly defined, or very defined, was there thought about opening up the RFP to a bid that a company would come in and say, we know that it's marketable, we've had the assessment on it, we think we can make some money on this dredging material, and open it up to more dredging, or, you know, so even that the city county or RWSA only wants to spend $3.5 million, that if you open up the RFP a little bit, that allows more creativity with the marketable material, that you might get a couple more companies that would see that and say, we can market this material and actually dredge more for the $3.5 million.
I actually think our RFP was very broad and allowed that, and I think it allowed for that. That's why we went the PPEA route and not the traditional bid route, where what you just defined, the traditional bid, the engineer decides what happens and specifies it, and the bidders bid that. It has an inherent advantage that you pick the best price, so it's easy to pick the contractor. But this process was broad. That's one thing that I mentioned earlier that maybe I didn't emphasize enough, is that we were disappointed with the response. We were hoping for a broader response, and we were hoping for more of the kinds of ideas that you were talking about than what we got.
We have another question here.
Jim McAvey, you mentioned about the two proposals that didn't meet all the legal requirements. Do you have access to them, even though you're not allowed to, and I'm not sure what the right term would be, to officially consider them? But it seems like there could be valuable information in there, whether it's alternatives or different ways of looking. Are you able to look at those?
Obviously, we did look at them to determine if they met the legal requirements. Our lawyer said we have to, after 30 days, return them to the proposer, return them to where they came from. So that doesn't really give us an opportunity to hold on to them. But I'm speaking now in just following legal requirements.
We have another question. Well, here, yes.
Yeah, George Newcomb. I've got some property that backs up to the reservoir at Race Ford. Could you repeat again what the length of time is that this $3.5 million is going to get us in terms of water volume?
You're going to make me say the number again that I don't recall off the top of my head. I guessed it 3 years, but my memory may not be totally correct on that. What maybe I can do is look at my file tomorrow and send Robbie an email. You can send it out.
So that seems like a lot to spend for just 3 years value, what could be done to do a study and try to do something that would reduce the sediment so that the rate of material coming in there is significantly diminished, other than this thing you mentioned earlier? What is the source of all this sand?
Every river bend is somewhat unique. Every watershed has unique features in terms of where land developed area is and where forested area is, and all kinds of criteria. The idea of trying to understand where it comes from and why it's happening is extremely complex. There are folks who are smarter than I am who do some computer modeling, and they can say if you add this much forest to the watershed, you may reduce the amount of sand that flows from uphill into the reservoir by X amount on averages. It's probably not exact. I'm sure it's not exact. Another issue is that the hydrology of this basin, like most watersheds throughout the country, have been altered by development. When impervious surfaces are, especially any significant means, are put in, it accelerates how fast the peak of a storm hits the river and flows downhill, and that alters the stream banks. It alters the behavior of sediment. There are probably a lot of shoals and other features, I know there are, in our river now that are continuing to seek a new equilibrium. And seeking new equilibrium means when we get a big rainstorm, then it stirs the sediment up and it moves some distance downhill and then settles out again, and some of that settles out in the reservoir, especially the finer material. It's very, very, very difficult to solve. It would probably take more money than this county's got to solve all the problems in the watershed immediately. Things that we can do, focus in long term, and that's part of what we're doing in Buck Mountain Creek with our mitigation plan, is we're planting trees in riparian areas, some places 100 feet on both sides of the stream, some up to 300 feet on both sides of the stream, which will grow into tall and mature trees. And we know that forests, especially riparian forests along the streams, are going to help prevent additional sediment from getting in the stream, help the stream find its new equilibrium, at which point sediment should be significantly less. And it also does great things like keeps nitrogen and phosphorus out of the rivers and filters other pollutants that flow along the land so that the overall quality of the water is higher. We're doing 93 acres of riparian forest with 269 square miles. The number of total acres of riparian area in this watershed is a very large number. I don't know what it is, but it's a very large number. Wish I had it, because then that would give you some idea that we're doing. DEQ told us, DEQ is the state agency, told us that this was one of the best mitigation plans they'd ever seen, and they're really excited about it. But in terms of the percent of this watershed, it's a very, very small fraction of 1%. So it's a big problem.
Other questions? So in the back of the room?
Sorry.
Yep.
I'm Diane Burns, the property owner here. You mentioned that one day in the future, a pipeline is going to be built from here to Ragged Mountain. How far off in the future do you see that? Is that 5, 10, 15 years?
I sometimes ask my board that, and I don't get an answer. So I guess that means they haven't decided yet. Back in 2006, based on the water demand forecast we were using at that time, which was the best information available at that time, it looked like 2021 was a target date. I can tell you that water consumption since 2006 has not increased like that forecast said, and a new forecast was done last year that shows slower growth in consumption. So I would suggest that puts the need for the pipeline off several years. But I can't give you an exact number.
Has money already been put aside? Has it been funded already?
No. No, it's not been funded, which is another reason why it should not be built right now. And it doesn't need to be built right now. The new reservoir at Ragged Mountain itself gives us the additional yield that we need to get us through the next at least 10 years, probably 20, maybe even more than that.
It has enough drainage basin to fill that reservoir?
It doesn't have a larger drainage basin, but it has a larger storage pool. And a larger storage pool gets you through a drought, which is the name of the game in drought management. And then
Where
you
does it get its water?
gets its water from the Ragged Mountain watershed and the Sugar Hollow watershed.
Oh, so the pipelines through existing pipelines?
Yes, yes. And if we have to drain the Ragged Mountain Reservoir substantially to get through a drought, it will refill much slower with Sugar Hollow pipeline than with a new South Fork pipeline, which is the reason this new pipeline eventually would need to be built. But based on where water demand is right now, we don't need to run our observatory water plant at a high rate. It can be throttled down to a very low rate, which allows more water to come into Ragged Mountain from Sugar Hollow than what we are pulling out to treat. And it will be a slow refill, but it will, we've worked the numbers and it will refill until our water demand gets in the 13 to 14 million gallons per day range, and we're not there right now.
We have another question back there in the corner. And let me just say, we will need to wind this down pretty soon, but I'm delighted Angus has a question, and any more, I'd love to get them.
I'm Angus Murdoch. I'm a Fluvanna County resident and an RCS board member. And I guess I'll start this with a comment that our RCS has been involved in a number of issues opposing sand mines in places, in free-flowing sections of the river that we thought weren't terribly good for the river. Presumably those folks were at least hoping to make money from those mining operations. I'm not sure they would all meet your legal requirements for a project like this, but I'm pretty sure they wouldn't. But just a comment that obviously somebody's making money from scooping sand out of the river, and hopefully, yeah, gravel, silt, what used to be topsoil. Hopefully in the future they find some way to self-fund some of this. But if they can't, and the county doesn't have $1 million or $2 million a year to do dredging, what is the long-term scenario for the reservoir? I mean, what's it going to look like in low water? How long before it gets to the dam? And I mean, in just very general terms, I mean, what are we looking at if, for whatever reason, dredging can't or doesn't go forward?
To answer your question, if you assume nothing's done to the reservoir, and hopefully that's not going to be the case, but if you assume nothing's done to the reservoir, the one study we have that makes an estimate suggests that the this reservoir would be about 400 million gallons of storage in 50 years. If you keep running those numbers out, it looks like about 80 years. This is just drawing a straight line. It looks like about 80 years sediment could reach near the intake. That's why I said it's not a short-term problem, but it could be a long-term problem. The way you prevent it from being a long-term problem is you do some dredging, like the project we're talking about, and others down the road. Another thing that's kind of unknown, and it gets into kinetics, and nobody's studied this yet. I'm sure somebody could, but as a reservoir gets smaller and smaller, more of the fine sediment actually carries over the dam rather than settling out. So you would expect at some point it won't be a straight line anymore. It'll be a declining volume that settles out. Now, to those who think carrying it downstream is a bad idea, that's a problem. But in terms of how fast the reservoir actually fills up, at some point the rate it should slow down because more sediment will carry over. And hopefully in the long-term future, if we take care of our watershed, less sediment will get in the river to begin with. That's the hope. Most people I talk to who know something about this subject suggest because of what we call legacy sediment, what's already been eroded and is in the stream banks now, that may be more a long-term problem than a short-term problem, but hopefully we'll get there. And with any complex problem, you've got to take the first step. If you don't take the first step, you never get there. That's assured.
I have one more question, and then we'll wrap this up.
How polluted is the stuff that you dredge out of the reservoir? I mean, does it have all kinds of bad stuff in it? Yeah, well, I had the impression that
No.
silt had all kinds of mercury and other.
No, the sampling that HDR did some sampling in the reservoir when they did their study, and that study's on our website, and the answer is no, it's not polluted. It is, and that's a good thing because that means it is usable. I do want to say one thing about a comment I heard earlier about can people go out in the reservoir and dredge because it makes money on sand. HDR advised us that marketing dredged material, particularly sand, can reduce the total unit cost of dredging, which is a benefit to an owner like us. If you allow a contractor to market it when he removes it, he can give you a better price. But HDR did not say that it's marketable. It's marketable to the point that anybody who's in the sand business would just say, I just love to go in the reservoir and I'll do it for free. I wish it were, because then that would make things a lot easier. If we had people knocking our door down to get in our reservoir and dredge it for free, that'd be great. But none of them have, and HDR said that's not realistic.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you all for coming. This concludes the formal part of our presentation. And thank you, John and Rebecca, for being hosts in this lovely spot. So I think we've learned a lot.
Thank you.